Good evening, class. Um, I'm so happy to be with you guys today. Thoughts on the series of this class, file 304. The last 2 weeks we started this class. The first of the week we started with study of ecosystem. And last week we also had the cycling of nutrients in ecosystem. That's what we did last week. So we shall be continuing with today's class, which has to do with interaction of animals and succession in ecosystem. Interaction and succession is what we shall be considering today. As a review of what we did last week, we looked at the biogeochemical circle, most of the nutrients that are involved in the cyclings of nutrients. We mentioned water, we mentioned carbon dioxide, we mentioned oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and a few ones that we mentioned last week. We did look at some of them, their primary source, and processes involved in this cycling of nutrient. That was what we did last week. So for today, we shall be looking at interaction and succession in ecosystem. Without wasting much of the time, hopefully maybe one or two of you will join me later on. I shall be sharing the screen to show you what I've prepared for you guys today. Okay. All right. All right. Okay. An opportunity to welcome everybody to this online class about 304, which is general ecology. I want to take this opportunity to meet students who are previous about what we shall be doing this semester. We shall be having lectures already. We've had about 1 or 2 lectures on the study of the ecosystem. We also have class on cycling of nutrient in ecosystem. We find other topics. We'll also the interaction section in ecosystem. We also look at population timing, which includes statistics that are used to determine population structure. We are also going to look at communities, different types of students, different major communities, their passive values, and we'll be looking at the influence of man, the environment, particular factor. You can see that it's a rich knowledgeable topic. We're looking at discuss general biology. Student, my time. Thank you. Okay, back. That was an intro of what we shall be doing in this course. So this is about 304, and today's topic will be interaction and succession in an ecosystem. I may still remain Dr. Senawe Mekopete, and you can get me on email@gmail.com. All right. Population of different organisms live together in a community. And when they do that, they interact with non-living factors that are found in this community. These interactions among themselves are various ways for them to survive. So we'll be looking at the various forms of interactions between organisms in the same community or the same environment they stay with. So, as you can see on the PowerPoint there, we have three basic interactions. We have the predator and prey interaction. We have the symbiosis interaction. Under it, we have the commensalism, mutualism, and parasitism. And the last is what we know as the competition. And under it, it's subdivided into two. We have the interspecific and intraspecific. When we say predator-prey interaction, these are interactions between organisms in which one organism feeds on the other. One organism feeds on the other. And a good example is a lion hunting a gazelle in an open savanna of Africa. These predators, they have natural characteristics and develop recognizable strategy which assist them, which help them to hunt and capture their prey. So the strategy that they use to catch these prey are not obvious. Yes, they are very common. However, some employ some chemicals defense to wave off these predators. So what we're trying to say is that even though the predators develop some strategies for them to catch the prey, on the other side, there's some prey that also develop defensive mechanisms or chemicals in order to wave off their predators. Phenomena of snakes, lizards, and fish are well-known examples of these prey. And we also have bees, wasps, predator bugs, and these other ones which have chemicals they use to defend themselves and even also to kill their prey. So obvious, these are not limited not just to animals, even plants. There are among plants structures that are developed such as thorns, spikes, prickles to discourage browsers like vertebrate herbivores feeding on them. So that is what we know as predator-prey relationship. Now we're looking at symbiosis interaction. What is symbiotic interaction or symbiosis? Symbiotic relationships are those in which two or more kinds of organisms live together. Two or more kinds of organisms live together. And such relationships are beneficial either to the both or to one. Example of symbiosis includes lichens, which are associated with certain fungi, or with green algae, which are the cyanobacteria. That's another example of symbiotic relationship or examples that we have. So we said major types of symbiotic interaction are commensalism. And in nature, what we understand about commensalism is that the individual of one species are often physically attached to those of other. Yes, the individual of one species are often physically attached to other. For example, we have the epiphytes, which are plants that grows on the branches of other plants. The host plant is on arm, while the organisms that grow on it benefit. So we're talking about relationship of two organisms in which the host of this plant is not armed from the other plant growing and also benefiting from such relationship. We also have an example of marine barnacles, which grows often among moving sea animals. They are also carried from one place to another. What the barnacle benefits that get protections from predators and also free movement, which is source of the food. That's a typical example of a commensalism that we know. What about mutualism? As the name implies, mutual. I know when we hear mutual, what does it come to our mind? It's benefit, both groups benefit. So in mutualism, each organisms involved in the symbiotic relationship benefit from each other. We have the leaf cutter ants in the tropics, which are known to remove a quarter or more of the total surface of the plant in a given area. But they do not just eat the leaf, but take them to the underground waste where they chew them and inoculate them with the spores of particular fungi. These fungi are cultivated by the ants and brought from one specific prepared bed to another where they grow and also reproduce. In turn, these fungi constitute the primary food of the ants and their larvae. We also have an example of ants and aphids, which provides an example. The aphids are small insects that suck roots from the phloem of living plants, while their piercing mouthpart. They now extract a certain amount of sucrose and other nutrients from the fruit, but which is excreted in all outer form through their anus as honeydews. So the ants carry the aphids to new plants where they come in contact with new source of food, and they use the honeydews as food. So that's just two examples of mutualism that we mentioned. Relationship between two organisms that benefits each other. We have the last one, parasitism. And we're quite familiar with the term parasite. We say parasite, someone that is benefiting in a relationship with someone else, but then the other person they are getting benefit from, it's not actually benefiting from that relationship. Sometimes they could be harmed or they could be killed. So parasitism is a relationship in which is harmful to the prey organism and beneficial to the parasite. That's just the simple, terms to describe this relationship that we're talking about. And parasite is much smaller. Most must know that this parasite is much smaller than the prey and remain closely associated to it. Okay, a simple example of this is mosquito and human being. We know what mosquito parasite can do to us, isn't it? As small as they are, they've been able to cause so much havoc to the human population. So both vertebrates and invertebrates are characterized by members of different phylums of animals and protists. Parasites could either be internal or external. And when we say parasites, internal, for example, of humans include tapeworm, roundworm, and hookworm. These are examples of internal parasites found in humans. So, and one fact is that the internal parasites are generally marked by much more extreme specialization than the external one. So it means that they must be specific in their damage to the host. The more closely the life of a parasite is linked to that of its host, So the more its morphological and behavior are likely to have been modified during the course of its evolution. So they've been able to modify it so that they were able to suit with the life forms that exist in their host. Then we'll talk about external parasites that lives on the bodies of vertebrates, mainly birds and mammals, and they could include lice and fleas. And these ones have also developed structures to attach themselves to the air or the feathers of these mammals or birds. Invertebrates are also parasites. Many fungi and some flowering plants are also parasites, and other plants and few ones are pets of crops. So parasites are not just exclusive to animal, but also to plants. Now, this takes us to the last of the interaction that we talk about, which is competition. Competition. I know one may easily feel that competition is just not an interaction or a relationship, maybe an activity, but it is an interaction that occurs within organism, within a community or ecosystem. Why competition exists because of resources, same resources that these organisms want, which are in short supply. And that's why these results to competition. So they seek these resources, and because they seek these resources, they will not harm one another in the process. So that's what they call it, interference competition. So competition could be two, as we can see, it could either be interspecific competition or intra-specific competition. Inter, as we say, refers to interaction between organisms of different species. Inter, different species. Intra, interaction or competition within organism of same species. Yes. And interspecific competition often greatest between organisms that obtain their food in a similar way. What we're trying to say is that organisms that obtain their food in a similar way will exert this kind of interaction or competition. So that's what we have for competition, and we talk about. And apart from food, animals also compete for space, for mates, and for any other thing that are necessary for their survival. These are the different reasons why these organisms compete. So, in conclusion, as regard the interaction we talk about, we've seen that organisms within ecosystem interact among themselves at interspecific and intraspecific level. And we also say that interaction can never be negative or positive. And when we say negative is that it could be harmful to the host, and it could also be beneficial to the host. And we also see and also seeing that interaction or competition results mainly as results of limited resources that are found in the ecosystem. So this now brings us to the first class activity, which the question will be, list 3 examples of predator-prey interaction in your locality. List 3 examples of predator-prey interaction that you can find or can see in your locality. I'll be giving you guys a minute or two for this class activity. All right, open, you have been able to at least put 1 or 2 points. I've not seen anybody in the class to see if we can have an audience discussion on it. So we want to move to the next point, which is succession. It is noted that the ecosystem has a tendency to change from one simple, complex processes. This process is what we know as succession, process of ecological change over time in a given area of an ecosystem from simple to complex. Yes. An example could be a vacant open space or clear woods, which slowly becomes occupied with an increasing number of larger and larger plants. An open place that will be plant, and over time, you will see plants coming up, growing, and becoming trees. Or it could be a pond. Ponds filled with vegetation that encroaches from the sides and gradually turn it into a dry land with vegetation. You will quite agree that there are places you would note that used to have water, more like a pond or like a lake. But over time, vegetation will lead to such ponds becoming a dry land. Vegetation will grow, sand movement will come into the pond and becomes a dry land. So ecological succession, as we know, sets occur from a simple to a complex phenomenon. This change occurs even when the climate remains stable year after year. So it's not necessarily that climate as a factor in changing this process. Even though it's made sense, you will still see that there will be a change in this ecosystem. So succession is continuous and worldwide in scope. That is to mean it's dynamic, it changes. And for example, a wooded area land is cleared and left alone. Plant will slowly reclaim the area. You quite agree with me that this has happened. So now we have two types of succession. We have what they call primary succession and secondary succession. Yeah, primary succession occurs on bare, lifeless substrates like a rock or uncolonized ground, which has never had any vegetation growing on it before. Or it could be in an open water like newly formed lake. That is what we know as primary succession. It may also occur on sand dunk, lava flow of new volcanic islands, landslides, or lakes left behind after the retreats of glacier. These are different example primary succession occur. Take for example, on a bare rock, the process may start with the growth of pioneer species like lichens, forming small pockets of soil. Acidic secretions from this lichen and from the plants that grow on the rock later help to break the substrate and add to the accumulation of the soil. Mosses may then colonize these pockets of soil, eventually followed by ferns and the seedlings of other flying plants. Over many thousands of years now, or even longer, the rock may be completely broken down and the vegetation over an area where there was once a rock outcrop may just be like that of a surrounding grassland or forest. That's what we understand as primary succession. The next slide shows what we're talking about, the primary succession. You can see the first column here, the bare rock. And what we're saying is that lichen are found dropping on these rocks, are found on these rocks. As they continue to grow, they break. You can see, note that these rocks, they are bigger, and these ones have been broken down. They've been wearing out. They've been broken down, broken down. As they break down, these lichens secrete chemicals, and these chemicals, help breaking down the substrates and add to the accumulation of the soil. And on the third column, we can see the small annals of plants and lichens are forming on the topsoil. As time goes on, this process of plant or crops or plant germination can lead to grasses and perennial plants growing. As the years goes by, the grasses become shrubs and shades, where you have intolerant trees such as the pine, and eventually it gets to climax. You've seen that the process is in 3 stages. The process of primary succession is in 3 stages. We have the pioneer species, which covers from the bare rock stages to where you have the grasses and the perennial plants. After the perennial plants, you have the intermediate species, where you have the grasses, the shoots growing. And finally, you have what they call the climax community, where you have the big trees like the oak and the hickory. It's where the primary succession comes to an end. Remember, we said there are 2 types of succession. We'll just look at primary succession, and now we'll be looking at the secondary succession. But before then, we must also understand that in this process, the climate keeps changing. And then another fact is that the process of succession in this primary stage, it's slow. It takes hundreds of years for it to get to climax, hundreds of years. And also, the nature of the region of vegetation is being determined to its extent by human activity. So these are factors that really contribute both positively and negatively to the process of the primary succession. Now we have the secondary succession. Yes, remember, it's after the climax that the secondary succession takes place. If a wooded area is cleared and left alone, plant will slowly reclaim that area. Eventually, traces of the clearing will disappear and the areas will begin with woods. The sequences of vegetation developing on this previously vegetated and clear area are called secondary succession. The changes that occur on abundant cultivated land or that takes place when a fire has burned off an area can also be known as secondary succession. So all the big drama we're talking is that when a particular ecosystem or region gets to the climax, as we can see, assuming it's being cleared for agriculture, or there's an outbreak of fire, it burns everything in that area to the ground. That is why you could see where the second column shows roasted trees and no vegetation on it. That's within a year or less than a year that occur. After 1 year, what you will see are annual trees or plants growing on the soil. As they keep growing, they also other grasses and perennial plants will also develop, and that's what we know as the pioneer. The pioneer species are the first to come up after the destruction or after the clearing of these ecosystem. Then after then, grasses will have the shrubs and other grasses growing, and these eventually will lead to a climax community. It's a simple process, a very simple process, but then it takes maybe 150 years or so for this process to be complete. You can understand that secondary succession It's not as complex as the primary succession one. Secondly, primary succession takes much of the time for this process to get to its climax, whereas the secondary succession will just take less than 100 years or 150 years for it gets to a climax. So that's the phenomenon about these two successions. But one fact must remain that the major factor that affect these processes is human influence. Yes, human interference in agricultural production and other activities has really changed the process of this succession that nature has given us. So now the next second class activity, which I want to ask is mention locations where primary succession can take place. Mention locations where primary succession can take place. I'll be giving you a minute or two to see what you can do. All right. Hoping you've been able to jot something down for a one-term succession, and we'll look at the different types of succession, factors that contribute to succession. So in summary, we have seen that primary succession starts from the scratch in area that originally bare rock, like rock or open water, whereas secondary succession takes place in area where the community organisms have already existed, shaded, and have been disturbed. But the fact is, both of this succession ultimately leads to the formation of a climax community if they are not disturbed. So, succession is a biological process that changes from simple to complex, and these occur over time in a given area of an ecosystem. Primary, secondary, and seeing bare rock succession, succession that have taken place from the disturbed community. So, and we've all, in conclusion, we've also seen that humans, by their agricultural activities, have been able to disturb this process in many parts of the world. So that is what we have for our class today. Thank you for coming, and I want to round up. All right, welcome back. That was PowerPoint for our class today. Interaction, succession, ecosystem or in ecosystem. I will be uploading this video so that we can go through and see what we did for the class. Next week, we shall be looking at population dynamic. So I implore everybody please to be available for this class next week. Thank you for your time. Please don't forget to go to the course material and see how you can get some of this information that are needed for this course. Thank you. Hoping to see you guys next week.